Eurosif webinar this afternoon on the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. First of all, apologies, we're starting slightly late. We had to face some of the technical glitches, but that's all resumed. So I hope you can all hear us and see us well. Really this afternoon, we're going to have a webinar where we're going to have a conversation between myself, Victor van Hoorn, Executive Director of Eurosif, with Will Oulton, the Chair of Eurosif, who's joining us as well. And the focus of the conversation will be on the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is a piece of regulation impacting, I think, quite a lot of you on the call. And so we thought there's quite a bit of developments, quite a bit of confusion, and people are seeking answers. So we thought it was timely to have a conversations as members of the SIFs all together on what we know, what's going to happen over the next couple of months, and how, what are some of the answers people are looking for, and we're going to try to provide as many answers as we can based on the questions we received when everyone registered. So, Will, do you want to say a few words as well?
Thank you, Victor. Yes, and good afternoon, everybody. As well as being the chairman of Eurosif, I work for First Century Investors as an asset manager. So as all the asset managers on this call will know, SFDR is looming large over many of us at the moment in preparation for next March when the regulation comes into force. And certainly in my conversations with peers across Europe, there is still, I guess, a little bit of confusion about some of the elements of SFDR and what to expect and what needs disclosing by when. So hopefully this afternoon, we will be able to clear up some of these myths, and I hear them all the time. So people can understand exactly, what is required, what's the pathway to compliance. And we'll highlight some of the issues which I think do remain outstanding, Victor, that we will discuss in terms of what comes next, particularly in terms of how taxonomy regulation fits into SFDR and what we can expect from things like the MiFID II Delegated Act for advisors, which again link into the bigger picture. So hopefully the next 55 minutes or so will be helpful and informative for everybody on the call. That's the plan anyway.
Okay, thank you, Will. And I would say to the audience as well, you have a Q&A function at the bottom where you can ask questions. We've structured our conversation today based on the questions we received from you and the most pressing questions, but do feel free to ask them in the chat function, and we'll try and address them at the end, if some of the topics haven't been dealt with yet in our conversation.
So we should kick off at the beginning, which is always,
yes,
I guess, a good place to start with these discussions, because I think there's one thing with SFDR is that although it sort of seems all-consuming at the moment, it's actually one component of a bigger European Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And I think it'd be useful, Victor, if we could just start to kind of remind people where SFDR fits within this bigger picture, and just so we start at the same place, because it's quite relevant to the discussion when we start to add pieces of other elements of the regulation as we move through the discussion. So remind us how this SFDR fits into the bigger picture.
Thanks, Will. So I think it's good to take a step back and understand a bit where we got here. SFDR was one of the cornerstones of the first European Commission Action Plan on Sustainable Finance from 2018. At that time, under that European Commission, sustainable finance was, I guess, more of a standalone issue in the broader political agenda. People had understood the importance of that area following the Paris agreements, and then the instauration of this high-level expert group who designed the plan, and that was the start of the journey. Now, obviously, last year we had the European election, and we had a new European Commission coming in for a new political cycle of 5 years. And the big difference is that now we have big initiatives like the EU Green Deal, the European climate law. We are talking about setting new broad goals on, for example, greenhouse gas emissions for the European economy. So whereas on the previous Commission, sustainable finance was an maybe isolated policy agenda, it now is actually one of the many policy chapters that we've opened on this European Commission, where the idea is really to start discussions around getting all the important sectors of the economy to transition. So we had under the previous Commission a EU sustainable finance strategy. Part of that was the SFDR. We are going to get a new version of that strategy in March of next year, which will lay out the roadmap for policy initiatives under this Commission. But as part of, so SFDR was really at the inception of sustainable finance. And what's really important to understand is when policymakers started to have a look at sustainable finance and responsible investment, they noticed that there was a need for more transparency across the investment value chain, a better understanding and categorization of the different investment solutions and products out there. But also a pretty big concern was the rising issue of greenwashing, with an increasing, very high growth numbers in the area of responsible investment and ESG investment and what have you. Everyone always knows that in a very high growth industry, you're always going to get challenged concerning integrity of all the products and market participants. And so tackling greenwashing, bringing more transparency and comparability was really the cornerstone of that legislation, but I said it fits in a much broader policy agenda.
Excellent. And it's one component of the sort of 10-point action plan under the Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And it's worth sort of remembering that although it's particularly relevant to the kind of asset management side of the industry, it is sit within that broader picture. Should we move on to basically what are the key concepts, I guess, underlying the SFDR and what the kind of people need to look out to? Because we have a language of articles which is becoming kind of a part of the lexicon of the industry, actually, that we'll explore as we go forward. So could you just run us through and explain what are these articles and why they're relevant and what do they do within the context of the SFDR?
Sure. And to start off on that journey this afternoon, I think it's important to start at the starting point. I think what's often or not fully appreciated by everyone dealing with the SFDR is the fundamental principles behind the piece of legislation. And I think this is neatly encapsulated by the different definitions that are used in the text. On the one hand, clearly, as I said, there's a multitude of responsible investment products, ESG products coming to the market. So really a focus was on what the legislation refers to as sustainability risks. This is really the risk side of the equation, where policymakers wanted those products to provide a more consistent and more harmonized and coherent disclosure about the ESG risks that every investment product is exposed to. So this is really this risk component. On the other side of things is the definition of sustainability factors and sustainable investments. And under sustainability factors also, I think now everyone dealing with the legislation has come across them, those so-called principal adverse impact indicators. And this is really the idea that you're looking at what are potentially ways of measuring the impact of investments undertaken on the real world, on sustainability indicators and more broadly the environment in which those investments are occurring. And this is not something new to European policymaking. So I think that's important to stress that. When the EU launched a couple of years ago its first version of the directive on non-financial reporting, the so-called NFRD directive, one of the underpinning core principles was that so-called double materiality, where you're trying to get companies to report both on the impact ESG factors can have on their business, what is the financial material impact that these factors can have, but also the mirror side of the equation, which is what is the impact of that company's business on sustainability indicators and the environment in which it operates. SFDR in that way is, if you want, a bit of a mirror image for the investment industry, where what policymakers are trying to do is get an idea of the risks for investment portfolios, but equally start along that probably more challenging journey, but of understanding what is the impact of those investments on the environment in which investors are investing and allocating their funds.
Okay. I think there might be an issue in terms of the slides. So Victor, I don't know whether we can make the slides clearer to the audience. It sounds like there's a bit of feedback that it's not full screen. So maybe, I think you're in control of the slides. Maybe we can address trying to fix that as we kind of go.
Is that better now?
Now that looks better. Yes, I think hopefully that's solved the problem. Just as we were talking then about this sort of the construct of the regulation and the varying different articles, I mean, I think it's important to note that a number of the articles refer to entity level disclosures, and the principal adverse impacts come into that as well. And then the subsequent more, which has got more focus, I think, is the different product assigned levels. And we'll talk about Article 6, what constitutes Article 6, and then the differences between Articles 8 and 9. But it brings us into the kind of realm of, well, how do you sort of distinguish between the entity level disclosures and by when, and then what needs to be done at sort of more product level? So should we look at what is the kind of requirements around disclosure for asset managers and product manufacturers who are promoting products to European-based clients?
Sure, and I think as you quite rightly said, I think the main distinguishing feature in the legislation people need to understand is a difference between entity level and product level, which is a core component, and people need to be aware of that. Broadly speaking, at entity level, there will be, asset managers will be required to describe for their entire business, so their entire operations, what they do with sustainability risks, how they integrate that, how they deal with those. So develop a policy on that. They will also need to disclose how they're potentially taking into account those sustainability risks in their remuneration policies for their staff. But I think probably the item that has by far garnered the most attention in discussions up to now is the reporting at entity level on those principal adverse impact indicators, which the ESAs, the European Supervisory Agencies in charge of drafting those rules, proposed earlier this year, which was that at entity level, asset managers would need to report across a number of indicators. I think there was a very clear list of mandatory indicators and voluntary indicators. I think we're at the stage where probably the European Supervisory Agencies have understood that what they initially proposed was probably going to be very challenging for firms to comply with in terms of data availability. We're hoping to see a final draft of those rules come out in January of 2021. And there we may see a different allocation of indicators across the mandatory and voluntary categories. And I think it's also fair to understand that while people were many firms were very worried about the application date, those requirements will all kick in March 2021. For many firms, it will be on a comply or explain basis from that date. From June 2021, this indicator reporting will become mandatory for firms that have more than 500 employees. But it's good to, and here it's good to spend a minute in emphasizing the nuance. The application date will start on that date, but actually the first reporting date on those indicators will not materialize before June 2022. So people will have a little bit more time to produce those disclosures, and it's fair to emphasize that regulators, as we understand, are not expecting firms to have a ready-made disclosure of those indicators as of June 2021. So I think that's very important for people to understand. Separate to that, of course, there is the product level disclosures, which are really the types of disclosures are going to depend on which categories of products that you're distributing and manufacturing are classified on. We'll get to that in a moment. But broadly speaking, you will have 3 sets of disclosures to comply with, a lot of information to be posted on your website. You will have to provide some disclosures on sustainability issues in pre-contractual information. So usually the prospectus for most of the funds. And then a 3rd set of disclosures will be in the periodic reporting, the quarterly or annual report you provide to your investors. So these are really the 3 building blocks. I think on that, the legislation is quite clear about which type of disclosure information needs to be where. So I don't think we'll spend much time on the specifics here, but that is actually there. We encourage people to read closely the legislation, and it should provide you with a pretty good basis on what needs to be disclosed.
Yeah, I mean, the legislation is a bit of an effort to go through if you're not highly familiar with the way kind of European legislation is crafted. So it takes a bit of work and effort for non-legal people to translate. But just if we could just go back one slide again, I just want to just make sure that the different elements that you described, we can clearly map them to the relevant articles in the legislation. So the first one there, the policy on integration of sustainability risk, that's Article 3 in the draft regulation. The next one about the remuneration policy is Article 5. So if anybody's looking for some reference point there, and it's about ensuring that remuneration policies are consistent with the integration of sustainability risk. So it's for investment professionals. It's particularly aimed at that, but that's Article 5. For the sustainability, adverse sustainability impacts, that's Article 4. So if you're not confused by now, you hopefully will be fine at the end of the session, but they're all kind of clearly stated out if you can unpick them through all the documentation. And that's one of the things that certainly in our organization, it took quite a while with different people to understand how all these kind of fit together and the sequencing. And then we come to really the more interesting part in many ways, which is, how do products then fit within this scope? So shall we move on?
Absolutely.
So the question of how do we navigate compliance? And I think here, Victor, it'd be worth just clarifying for people the difference between, again, what is called level 1 and level 2, because we've seen, subsequent to the consultation over the summer that, there was a reaction, let's say, from industry to the content of that, particularly around the indicators for the principal adverse impacts, which, in our discussions with the Commission, I think they said, we published them to start a dialogue with the industry. I think many people didn't see it quite that way and saw that as actually this is what the expectation on the industry is. So there's clearly going to be some clarification of what expectations are come the end of January when the ESAs give us a more technical details about what's expected there. But that was certainly a controversial part of the consultation over the summer. But since then, there's been some narrative which has come out to various supervisory authorities across Europe about the extension of the period for level 2. So just so everybody again is clear, can you just make sure that we all understand the difference between what's level 1 mean and what does level 2 mean?
Absolutely, I think that's very important that we're all on the same page, and that is actually a cornerstone of the development of any financial services policy and regulation in the EU. Level 1, that's the legislative instrument that is proposed by the Commission, negotiated by the co-legislators, so the European Parliament on the one hand, the Council representing all the EU member states. They reach an agreement, it then gets published in the official journal, that is deregulation. So the SFDR itself is a piece of level 1 legislation. Of course, in the context of those negotiations, you can't expect them to agree and develop all the detailed technical rules to comply with all these requirements. So they tend to be on a more high-level basis. The legislation then gives mandates to the European Supervisory Agencies or the European Commission to adopt technical rules that will give market participants a bit more detailed guidance on how it works. And here I think it's very important to understand the following. And this is actually enshrined in the European treaties. So it is a cornerstone of EU law. When it comes to strategic essential elements of the legislation, such as key definitions, scope, who it applies to, etc., this can only be legally interpreted and agreed on in the level 1. This cannot be reopened, revisited in the level 2. So in a way, sometimes when the level 1 text is not clear or not helpful, despite the best intention and the best goodwill of the European Supervisory Agencies, they cannot alter that. So we have to deal with that. So the level 2 really only provides details on the mandates they've been given by the legislation. It's part of good governance and democratic institutions, so we can't change that. And I think it's fair to also highlight that there's something called level 3, which is at the end of the process, when we've got the level 1, we've got the level 2, there are often still unanswered questions on how you apply those. And then what we will probably see once the level 2 rules have been finalized, we will start to see a process of Q&As, questions and answers, where the ESAs will try to respond to the most pressing questions from the industry on how to comply with certain requirements, and will probably issue interpretive guidance to help market participants. So these are really the 1, 2, 3 levels that we're dealing with.
Right. So, and as we understand it, the ESAs seem to be on target for sort of end of January to clarify the level 2 requirements through the sort of technical release. So that's a date that to note for everybody, or a sort of approximate date. We haven't got the date, but towards the end of January is what we're hearing is on target. So that's good news. Okay, so take us through what to expect in terms of what we know about the level 2 rules right now.
So initially they were supposed to have been finalized by December of this year, so that they would be ready for the application date of March and June 2021, as we've seen on the previous slide. Of course, it's fair to say that the rulemaking process has been disrupted by the COVID pandemic as well, a very busy agenda. So that all has faced some slight delay in the timetable, which means we're now in the situation that we know the level 1 legislation will start applying as of March and June, while the technical rules that are clarifying how to comply with some of these components will not be finalized, nor will they be applicable. I think we've all seen the press coverage and the different statements, but it seems increasingly clear that we should expect an application date for those level 2 rules for January 2022. And one of the major questions in the market is, how do you bridge that transition period? How do you bridge from March 2021 to January 2022? As the Commission made very clear to the European Supervisory Agencies, the initial application date will remain, so the legislation will start applying. The expectation is that firms will have to comply on a principled based, on the best effort basis with the requirements. I think everyone can agree that it's not the most satisfactory situation we're in, but I think it is something we all have to deal collectively as a industry. What we will see, and that's the question mark, is whether we get any additional clarification at European level on how to bridge that transition. What are reasonable expectations from firms and regulators in that time frame? But actually, quite likely, what we'll see is a supervisory dialogue emerging between firms and their local supervisors on what is an appropriate level of expectation. And I think we're already seeing some of that emerge and getting more clarity on how firms will have to comply in the transition phase. So our advice will be, if you haven't done already so, contact your regulator and see what is the expectations on you for 2021. So maybe you want to share something on that, Will, as well.
Well, yes. I mean, at First Sentier, we've prepared prospectus wording changes and allocated products into the different assigned article categories, and lodged that with the CBI in Ireland as the regulator for many of our products. And they've said that they're not really going to look at these things in detail right now, and that they are expecting for funds to essentially self-certify come March. Now that usually means, if anything, like what happened with the sort of MiFID process would be a sort of legal advisor or third party to certify that funds have been appropriately disclosed within the prospectus. I mean, we're getting some questions on wording, but it's not unusual for clarifications. I think many managers haven't started that process yet, so one of the things I would urge everybody to do is get going, because it takes a while to get through that process. And the regulate supervisory authorities across Europe are going to be flooded with work to do in terms of new language around SFDR. So the earlier the better. If you haven't started, definitely start thinking about that right now. So should we move on to look at the product categorizations? Because this one, I do sense there is slight confusion here, and certainly the Article 8 categorization gets a lot of debate. But one of the things I think it's worth just pointing out, that for Article 6, every in-scope product is required to disclose for Article 6. It's the minimum standard. It's not optional. Now, products may choose to assign to Article 8 or 9, but everything in scope is covered by Article 6. And I think that's worth reiterating, because I've heard many people in both internally in my own organization and across the industry not be 100% clear about that. But that's the state, is that everything must be disclosed Article 6, and can choose to select to assign for Article 8 and 9 with different disclosure standards. So let's have a look at what they are and what they might be. So over to you, Victor, to help us navigate 6, 8, and 9.
Thanks, Will. And indeed, I think the classification of products is probably one of the trickiest parts and the most essential parts of applying properly the framework and of understanding the implications fully. And I think here it's first of all important to bear in mind that the way regulators have looked at it is really more substance over form. They're not necessarily, they didn't necessarily decide to draft their rules around, broadly agreed categories in the industry or industry standards. What they were really looking to achieve is going to the substance of what a product does and understanding therefore in which categories it will fall. And I think the best way I've found to understanding it is actually that matrix we've got on the slide there, which is really asking oneself the question, is my product subject to requirements in terms of sustainability, of ESG, that are either really binding on the manager or that are more of a discretionary nature? I think that's the first dimension to bear in mind. And the second one,
Victor, there's one clarification. I think there's a danger that might be slightly misinterpreted, because when we're going to talk about binding in a minute, it's in relation to specific language relating to Article 8, really, about the promotion of social and environmental characteristics being binding. I don't want people to get confused that discretionary for Article 6 means you don't have to disclose Article 6. You do. It's the issue. It's the issue around binding. We'll come to it slightly different to what it might look at a glance in that chart. And I think that's just worth pointing out.
Yes, it's not binding or discretionary in terms of disclosure. It is whether it impacts the way you run your portfolio and your asset allocation. I think that's important to emphasize. And indeed, the second dimension is, are those criteria that you're applying to the asset allocation process and decision making around investments is that criteria that looking at financial aspects, also at sustainability aspects, that maybe more of a non-financial nature. I think it's good to bear in mind those lenses before you start you start down that journey of classifying your products. As you said quite well, transparency on sustainability risks, and again emphasis on risks, is not optional for certain products. It applies to all products. You can decide as an asset manager to disclose that those risks are not relevant to the product you're operating, but you will have to say something about that in those disclosures. And for example, we will get there in a minute, but a product that does ESG integration at a simple level, looking at ESG factors and how that might integrate into financial decision making, is the common expectation from regulators we've spoken to is that that one will be certainly subject to requirements in Article 6, but that will probably not be enough to graduate it to an Article 8 or 9 product. The Article 8 product is really around, as you said, in a binding way, promoting environmental or social characteristics as a distinguishing feature of the product. And that means the product is to a certain degree subject to binding requirements when it comes to how asset allocation occurs from a sustainability perspective. The Article 9 category, which is commonly referred to as even more ambitious or dark green, if you want, categories of products, that is when you take an approach whereby those binding requirements essentially apply to the entirety of your portfolio, where you conduct an analysis across the entirety of your portfolio. As we've seen at the beginning on the notion of sustainable investment definition is key to understanding which products would qualify as an Article 9 and which ones would not meet that threshold and probably be allocated in Article 8. We're expecting quite a few products to be in Article 6, quite a few products to probably be in Article 8. I think the assumption is that the number of products in Article 9 at the beginning will remain fairly limited, or at least will have a more limited size when it comes to assets under management. And the difference really between 8 and 9 is around this application of the analysis of the do no significant harm analysis, which we'll get to in a minute, but that's the distinguishing feature. At a later stage, there will be an additional element to bear in mind, because the legislation, the SFDR, and that is in the level 1 of the legislation, Article 7, makes clear that as of December 2022, managers will have to disclose whether or not particular products are taking into account the principal adverse impact indicators. And if you remember, that is the one that fits in your entity disclosures that you will have to report on at your entity level, but whether a product takes those indicators and those indicators inform the investment process of that product to try and mitigate those indicators. That is the expectation. There will be an additional disclosure to be done by then, and that will probably, we'll see an emergence and difference between different products. Important to stress here that there is, for that set of disclosures and classification, no mandate from the European supervisory authorities to specify that further. So we will not see any additional technical rules to help managers in making that distinguishing factor in Article 7. But I think also in the final thing to stress here on that distinguishing of those different categories, when it comes to Article 8 as well as Article 9, the SFDR does not set any minimum quantitative or detailed requirements on what a product should be doing. So you will not be able to find either in the SFDR or the level 2 or even the level 3 further guidance telling you, for example, my Article 9 product has to have X percentage minimum of sustainable investments in the portfolio. There is no such thing, which I think is also, it's quite important because that can lead to some of the uncertainty people are facing in classifying their products.
Yeah, that's one key point. I think there's a number of sort of key elements around that classification, because that's one of the key pieces of work that I know that asset managers will have been going through with their product portfolio. There's a number of kind of questions that we're seeing in the Q&A box. I'm hoping that we will answer them. We are looking at them and see as we go along, and if not, we'll try and mop them up towards the end. So don't worry if we haven't picked up on some of the issues that you've raised so far. So should we move on to the Eurosif Transparency Code? How would that map against the different articles, or as I saw today in a due diligence questionnaire from one of our clients, either mainstream, which I think was Article 6, light green, which I think they meant Article 8, or dark green, which I think was pointing at Article 9. So there's different sort of different descriptions we're seeing, but they're fundamentally based around this sort of Article 6, 8, 9, which will become the norm for our kind of European industry language, no doubt, in future. So let's have a look at sort of how you've gone about trying to map it to the sort of Eurosif model, and does it work and does it fit? Let's see.
I think that's a very good question, because we often see in discussions that people undertaking that exercise try always to go back to the rowing boat, or their safety comfort zone of the different strategies they understand well and what their product does. As I said, it's the regulation takes a substance over form approach, and so it's not as straightforward. So indeed, we've taken from the Eurosif Transparency Code different categories of strategies and tried to make some sense as to, broadly speaking, in which categories they'd fall. I always say broadly speaking with a note of caution, because every different product will be slightly differently designed, and so we can't probably provide a one-size-fits-all answer to that. But I think it's fair to say, if you take the first category of sustainability themed investments, where the expectation is that sustainability factors in the investment process are of paramount importance, are probably binding on the asset manager in the way he has to take those into account. Well, if you think about that, and you think that it might apply to part of the portfolio, then our expectation is probably will be an Article 8 product. If it's something more ambitious, where it's applied to the entirety of the portfolio, in some cases you could expect that to probably qualify as an Article 9. But again, product features are essential. When you look at best-in-class investment selection, that's a challenging one, with an unsatisfactory answer also, and then the regulators we've spoken to understand that challenge as well, because one of the things they're trying to unearth is how those best-in-class filters are applied, and what size of reduction of the investment universe you're talking about when doing that, or what are you trying to achieve with your best-in-class, and how stringent those requirements are. If there are requirements that are discretionary as well as easy to attain, the expectation is probably that there will be an Article 6, and it would be challenging to graduate to a better level at Article 8. If you're really applying robust best-in-class selection tools, also not only focusing on ESG financial factors, but you're also looking at hard sustainability factors, there's a chance these might be Article 8 products. On norm-based screening, where you're trying to screen norms, again, it entirely depends what norms you're applying to your product. Are they easy to attain? Is there a high level of discretion? We're not sure. It might be 8. If they're robust norms, there's a binding element to it. It is possible that they will qualify as Article 8. When we look to exclusion strategies, where you're excluding in certain issuers, certain sectors from your investment process, again here, I think what's interesting here from our discussion with regulators, it seems that they're looking very much at where is the exclusion policy applied, and again, how binding is it and how ambitious is it. If it occurs at firm level, so an asset manager saying, I adopt this policy for my entire firm, without being too specific, the expectation is that will probably be an Article 6 product only. If you can demonstrate that you're actually applying that at each portfolio and you have a more ambitious set of screens to exclude certain holdings, then again, the sounds we're hearing is that that will be an Article 8. As we've said before, a strategy where you're integrating ESG factor in your financial analysis, which is, I think, is one of the most widespread strategies in the market. There, we sense a strong consensus from the supervisors that that will be an Article 6 product disclosing sustainability risks, but that will not be enough to graduate to either be an Article 8 or 9. So I think that's very important. The fact that you're calling a product ESG or doing something with ESG does not mean that you're going to automatically fall in the more ambitious category of products. And I think that's something we have to keep emphasizing, because often we hear people saying, oh, my product ESG, therefore it should automatically be in Article 8. That's not as straightforward as that. I think impact investing strategies, that's very clear that if it's done on part of the portfolio, what we hear is that it'll probably be an 8. If you do it for your entire portfolio, again, that will be sufficient to qualify as 9. One of the strategies we had in the Eurosif Transparency Code is engagement and voting. We're not looking at it separately because, of course, key features of Article 8 and 9 are that the asset managers tries to invest in companies which are known for good governance practices. So, and engages with the companies to ensure that that's the case. So that is kind of embedded feature in a lot, an embedded expectation in a lot of the Article 8 and 9 products. And then finally, I think I have to point out to something specific in the legislation where we have a little bit more clarity, and that actually is around products that would have as a core feature reducing carbon emissions. There's a clear reference in Article 9 of the legislation. So we're expecting those that have a clear, not that take carbon emissions in discretionary ESG analysis, but actually that have a clear objective to reduce carbon emissions. Those will probably automatically feature in 9. However, here I'd say bear in mind that they normally should then be able to benchmark their performance versus either a one of the categories of climate benchmarks under the EU benchmarks regulation, so the climate transition benchmark or the Paris aligned benchmark.
So looking at this kind of mapping it can be helpful, but just highlights how there is still sort of little blurry lines between different categorizations. I think one thing just again to re-emphasize is the rationale for this sort of binding part of the Article 8 requirement and the reason for that as we understand it. So we were told by some people working on this in the commission that they'd seen too many fund prospectuses with kind of legal language, which basically had a caveat that under certain market conditions, then there's kind of the ESG elements of any product could be disapplied, and they were quite concerned about that would still allow for essentially greenwashing of products. So they made it's quite clear in the regulation that the promotion of social and environmental characteristics, as it's put for Article 8, is binding and can't be disapplied. If there are instances where there's caveats, then that's an Article 6 product. So that's again for all the people on the course worth just essentially re-emphasizing why that binding element is in there, sitting in that Article 8 requirement. So we've got some questions about, so where does the taxonomy fit into this, which is a great segue into, let's have a closer look at Article 9. So let's go there now.
Absolutely. So yes, I think Article 9 is clearly the category of products under the SFDR, which is the closest link to the EU taxonomy. As we said before, core feature to determine whether an article you are building and manufacturing an Article 9 product is whether you're investing in sustainable investments. As we said, essential feature of that definition is that you'd have to invest in investments that contribute to an environmental or social objective, why doing no significant harm to those objectives, and while these investments are in companies pursuing good governance practices. That's in a simplified way. Most people also following the taxonomy closely will know that the do no significant harm principle is embedded in the taxonomy in the process to define what is a sustainable economic activity under the taxonomy. Here it's important to stress that while these are similar, they're not entirely identical. And one of the reasons for that is that the taxonomy is still a tool under development. There's a lot of activity on the taxonomy. There's a lot of ambitions. Of course, we have under the taxonomy 6 environmental objectives. We have a question mark as to whether we will have a social chapter of the taxonomy. Currently, we have minimum safeguards in the taxonomy. And then there's a broader question marks of what is the, what do we consider as an adequate threshold for good governance practices in companies? So as you can see on the slide, essentially from our talks with the European Commission and other European supervisory authorities, the picture that comes out clearly is that the do no significant harm analysis under the SFDR is close, yet not perfectly identical to the one on the taxonomy, which also does mean that the universe of economic activities which would qualify as sustainable investments is probably larger than the universe of investments that would qualify as sustainable economic activities in the taxonomy. When you're trying to identify those investments, it is very clear when you're looking at the E category and you're looking at questions of climate mitigation adaptation, that an economic activity that satisfies taxonomy, that is considered an economically sustainable activity on a taxonomy, will be a sustainable investments for SFDR purposes. We will have to see, of course, how the further taxonomies for the other 4 financial objectives, environmental objectives, are developed in the course of 2021 and at a later stage, 2023 for those objectives. And there, gradually, as those criteria are developed and we get more clarity on that, you will be able to have a more granular analysis of what a sustainable investment is. I think at this stage, while those taxonomy is not yet in place, you can certainly, as asset manager, make a case that the activities covering those objectives or contributing to those objectives are sustainable. Of course, there will be a question of documenting that, coming up with robust and credible criteria to make that assessment, but there's nothing in the legislation tell you exactly what the test is that you need to apply. That is similar for the social taxonomy. As long as we don't have clear and detailed rules around that, those criteria and the S dimension, there is a certain discretion for asset managers in designing their own processes and robust analysis to evidence that, and to say those investments I've made, I consider them sustainable from a social objective perspective. For the governance bit, of course, we have some frameworks existing. We have something like the shareholder rights legislation, where asset managers are reporting on their engagement policies already, which are then slot in again into the disclosure on the SFDR. We are expecting in the course of next year the EU to launch legislative proposals in the area of sustainable corporate governance, and also mandatory due diligence in supply chains on environmental and human rights matters. We may, from that legislative activity, as well as further discussions at the EU Sustainable Finance Platform, which is dealing with those topics, as those talks evolve, we may hope to get more granular information on what is an acceptable level of analysis for those investments to qualify as sustainable investment. It is clear that is a challenging definition to apply. There's a lot of analysis going on. There's a lot to be expected, but then again, it is the category of products that is supposed to have the highest level of ambition in the SFDR classification.
Yeah, so essentially more pieces of the jigsaw to come is kind of what we're hearing. So with what we currently know about SFDR on a different assignment and categorization of products let's have a think about and a chat about what might that mean in terms of the information that the consumers of financial products across Europe get, and what might that mean, particularly with the MiFID II changes around the suitability testing requirement that advisors will be required to do, looking at what is the appetite, I guess one could describe it as, for sustainability outcomes from their clients' portfolio. So how does all this sort of help, which hopefully is the intent, that there's more information to make informed choices. So let's look at what that might mean in terms of for fund distribution and the business uptake of the different types of products.
So yes, thanks. I think that's indeed important to make the clear link between those two developments. In parallel to the development of the SFDR, there's a whole process, regulatory process to amend the suitability test on the MiFID II, the test that financial advisors, intermediaries have to apply when assessing whether financial products are suitable for non-professional clients on the MiFID II, but I think it gives a pretty fair indication of where policymakers' thinking is. What is interesting is that from the onset, in trying to define what the sustainability preferences of a client might be, I think, first of all, it's very clear, important reminder here, those sustainability preferences will still be second in rank behind the traditional suitability analysis that an intermediary has to do around the age risk profile, risk aversion, risk tolerance of a client, and then also sustainability preferences. But in trying to define that and give a bit more clarity to the industry, the European Commission's thinking is to link that definition to actually the classification process under the SFDR. And I think that's, again, another dimension of why that classification is so vitally important, to understand which, if a client, particularly a retail client, expresses preferences, which products will be available to him. At this stage, we've seen various drafts and various iterations of that over the last couple of months, but clearly the thinking seems to be that Article 9s will certainly be able to meet those sustainability preferences, as well as Article 8 in the near future. But here, I think it's good to emphasize, we mentioned the taking into account principal adverse impact, which as of December 22, asset managers will have to report on. The thinking is that beyond December 2022, it will really only Article 8 products that take into account those principal adverse impact indicators and try to mitigate that impact will actually be doing something about sustainability and therefore be good enough in terms of ambitions to meet those sustainability preferences from clients. I think there's been questions around, is that proposal then, before we even apply SFDR, gold plating the SFDR classification before we've even started? That we've seen discussions at events in the media on that, and also in responses from stakeholders, various consultations. I think here it's important to understand the challenge policymakers are facing, which is their goal is to come up with a product universe, so a set of eligible products that are ambitious enough to meet the sustainability preferences of clients. And that's the way they see it is a core way of limiting greenwashing. What they don't want is a retail investor coming in and saying, I want to put my money to work to improve the planet, and then being sold products that on the face of it look sustainable, but then actually are unable to deliver very limited impact. That's the situation they want to avoid. However, they're facing with the situation that the legislative framework they have is a disclosure-based one. As I mentioned, there is no quantitative detailed requirements for the level of ambitions for products. And so there's an area of tension between those two policy objectives. And that's why they've come up with this solution of limiting the sustainability preferences to Article 9 products, as well as some of the Article 8 products. Again, bearing in mind that a lot of the sustainability, ESG, responsible investment products on the market will probably end up in that category of Article 8, which will be quite broad, quite diverse, and therefore potentially, presents a set of challenge in terms of comparability.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be clearly one of the key the key next phases of assessment of the success of the SFDR regulation is to do we see any change in flows into more sustainable business activities and hence products, which is clearly underpinning one of the core policy drivers of the whole Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And I think the industry would welcome certainly a bit more constraints, I guess, around allowing for the more aggressive claims for different products across the industry. I don't think that does the industry any credits at all. So, having some standards where there is enough sort of wiggle room to determine and to communicate the characteristics of products is, I think, is going to be hugely helpful and welcome across the industry. We've got a little bit of time left, so I think we need to sort of wrap up quite quickly soon. So
I will just flag that element for people here. There is a possibility for the European Supervisory Agencies to issue further rules around marketing communications. Particularly, what our understanding is they might choose to do that if they see more exaggerated, more widespread exaggerated claims and marketing communications across the market. So while we currently haven't seen any activity on that front, that mandate exists in the legislation. So it's something to keep an eye on and watch out for, because we may see further developments in that area.
Yep. There's a few sort of questions I'd just like to kind of get to before we have to close. I mean, one of the questions is about scope, and particularly around things like segregated mandates. I mean, they are in scope for SFDR. That's quite clear in the legislation. So consider everything pretty much in scope if it's sold to European-based clients. And there's been quite a bit of chat about the principal adverse impacts and the indicators, the 32 indicators. I think, Victor, it's fair to say our view is that there'll be in January some sort of restatement of the intent of those indicators. It was one of the areas where there was a very strong pushback from industry. I think in our own analysis, we could see about a third of that data was widely available. That was set out in those indicators. About a third of it was partially available, and a third of it was either not or very, very scarce. So I think that came as a bit of a surprise, the reaction to that to the Commission. I think they were of view that this information was widely available and got to the reality check through the consultation process. So we don't know what that will come out as, but we certainly expect a bit of a softening in the requirements around the principal adverse impact indicators to be much more pragmatic in terms of the expectation on the industry. We've talked a bit about the taxonomy, so I don't kind of want to really go over the ground we covered earlier, but are there any kind of final points, Victor, you think that are worth sharing in terms of your insights and your communications that you've got going on with the Commission and the key people there about what to expect, or any things you think that people on the course should be looking out for next?
Yes, thanks. I think if I had to pick one of those, which we'll probably see early 2022, is further consultation on the way certain products will be required to disclose how their portfolio of investment maps out versus the taxonomy. So in effect, how far it's aligned with the EU taxonomy. In the EU taxonomy regulation itself, there are legal mandates for the Article 9 products and the Article 8 products partially to be required to disclose how their portfolio aligns with the taxonomy. We haven't seen consultation on that yet. The reason is also that the deadline for applying those rules is at a later stage. It's only as of 2022. But watch out for those ones, because that may also be a challenging consultation. But also, I think that is also something policymakers very much see as a complement to what we've discussed, which is we are facing challenges around classifying products, around matching the levels of ambitions and the comparability in terms of a level of ambitions. What they're thinking is that the having those products then disclose the alignment of the portfolios versus taxonomy may also be a very interesting information to assess the level of ambitions of the product on the sustainability objectives. So this is going to be an incredibly challenging, data-intensive piece of work. Again, we face the same challenges, that those disclosures will only work when corporate issuers or investee companies have made those disclosures. But I would say watch out for more activity in that space in the first half of 2021.
Excellent, thank you. And of course, at the same sort of time period, for those people on the call from the UK, we wait to see what the UK regime looks like. Hopefully, there will be some equivalence, so we don't end up across Europe with very different regimes, which will be a headache for certainly for UK-based participants. So just to wrap up, Victor, thank you very much for your time. So how can people get hold of you if they've got any further questions? We couldn't really get through all the questions that we saw in the chat box. So so there we are, your contact details, and I'm sure you'll be delighted to answer any further questions from anybody.
Absolutely. All the attendees today are members of SIFs. SIFs are all very active in Eurosif. So if you have any questions or need any guidance or further clarification on what's happening at the, at the EU level in the area of sustainable finance, especially as we're anticipating all that activity emerging again in 2021. It will be a very, very, very busy year in terms of policy development. Your SIFs should be able to direct you to me, and I'll be happy to assist where I can.
Great, thank you. 2021, clearly a year of some very exciting challenges and change for the industry. So thanks everybody for your attention today, joining us, and the questions that you posed. Hopefully we got through most of them, but we will leave it there, and thank you all very much. Goodbye.